The gate was locked. Clara Whitmore stood there with her hands on the rough wood, staring at the chain wrapped twice around the post like someone meant business. Behind her, the wagon that had carried her the last 40 miles was already gone. Just dust now, disappearing into the afternoon haze. The driver had dumped her luggage in the dirt, taken his money, and left without a word. Probably figured she wasn't his problem anymore. She was nobody's problem. That was the whole point. The ranch stretched out beyond the gate, all brown grass and distant mountains under a sky too big to make sense of. No house in sight, no smoke from a chimney, nothing that suggested people or warmth or the future she'd been promised in those letters. Just land. Empty, indifferent land. Clara pulled her coat tighter. November wind had teeth out here. "Thomas?" Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. She tried again, louder. "Thomas Wardell?" Nothing. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals she couldn't see. She watched it for a moment, envying the perspective. From up there, she'd be just a dark spot next to a gate, barely worth noticing. 3 months ago, Thomas Wardell's letters had arrived at her boarding house in Philadelphia like answers to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. Neat handwriting, careful words. A man who owned land, who worked hard, who wanted a wife to build something with. She'd written back. He'd sent money for the train. She'd packed everything she owned into 2 cases and a trunk, said goodbye to exactly nobody who mattered, and headed west with her stomach full of hope and her head full of pictures that turned out to be lies. The first lie, Thomas Wardell was a good man. The second lie, he'd actually wanted her. She'd figured out the truth about an hour ago, when he'd met her at the station in Collier Creek with a face like week-old bread and eyes that wouldn't meet hers. He was younger in person than she'd imagined, maybe 30, though he carried himself like someone older, beaten down by something. Not ugly, but not the square-jawed rancher from her imagination either. Just ordinary, tired. And the way he looked at her when she stepped off that train, like she was a bill come due that he couldn't pay, that should have told her everything. But she'd smiled anyway, extended her hand, said something bright and stupid about the journey. He'd shaken her hand like it was a dead fish. The ride out had been worse, long silences broken only by the wagon wheels and his occasional direction to the driver. She'd tried conversation, asked about the ranch, about the town, about his life out here. Got nothing but grunts and half-sentences. Finally, she'd just sat there, watching Montana roll past and feeling her hope curdle into something harder. When they'd reached this gate, his gate supposedly, he'd finally spoken more than 3 words together. "This was a mistake," he'd said. Still wouldn't look at her. "I can't. I thought I could, but I can't." "Can't what?" "This, you, any of it." He'd gestured vaguely at her, at the luggage, at the whole situation. "I'll pay the driver to take you back to town. There's a boarding house. You can stay there until you figure out whatever you need to figure out." The numbness had started then, that cold, spreading feeling like she was watching this happen to someone else. "You invited me here," she'd said. Her voice had sounded strange, distant. "You sent money. You wrote letters for 3 months." "I know what I did." "So what changed?" Finally, he'd looked at her, really looked. And what she saw in his face wasn't cruelty exactly. Cruelty would have been easier to hate. It was just nothing. Emptiness. Like he'd already decided she didn't matter and was just waiting for her to accept it. "Nothing changed," he'd said. "That's the problem. Go back to town, Miss Whitmore. This isn't going to work." Then he'd climbed on a horse that had been tied to the wagon, she hadn't even noticed it before, and ridden through the gate without unlocking it for her. Just left. The driver had muttered something about not getting involved in domestic affairs, taken the extra money Thomas had shoved at him, and dumped her here. And now she was looking at a locked gate with everything she owned scattered in the dirt and maybe $4 in her purse. Clara closed her eyes, breathed, opened them again. The gate was still locked. The land was still empty. The sun was still heading toward the horizon like it had somewhere better to be. She could cry. She wanted to cry. But crying wouldn't unlock the gate or bring back the wagon or change the fact that she'd burned every bridge in Philadelphia to come here, and there was nothing back there worth returning to anyway. Her mother was dead. Her father had made it clear years ago that daughters were expensive disappointments. The boarding house she'd left wouldn't take her back without money she didn't have. She had no friends, no family, no prospects. Thomas Wardell had been her last idea, and he'd just ridden away without looking back. So, no crying. Not yet. She turned around slowly, taking inventory. 2 suitcases, one with clothes, one with books, and the few personal items she'd thought worth keeping. A trunk with linens, a winter coat, her mother's china wrapped in newspaper. All of it sitting in Montana dirt like trash someone had dumped. The road was empty in both directions. Town was 40 miles back the way she'd come. The ranch, Thomas's ranch, was somewhere past this gate, but she had no idea how far. And even if she could get over the fence, even if she could find the house, he'd made himself pretty clear about her welcome there. Clara sat down on her trunk. Her legs just gave up. She sat and stared at nothing and tried to think. $4? Maybe enough for a week at that boarding house Thomas had mentioned, if the rates were reasonable. Which left her exactly where she'd been in Philadelphia. Broke, alone, running out of time. Except in Philadelphia, at least she'd known the streets. Out here she knew nothing, no one. The wind picked up. She could smell weather in it, something cold and damp coming from the mountains. Storm, maybe. She should move, find shelter, figure something out before dark. She didn't move. Somewhere behind her, a horse blew air through its nostrils.